Imagine this scene. You're a distinguished Roman senator, one of the most respected men in the empire. Your family name goes back generations. Your toga bears the purple stripe of nobility, and you've spent decades serving Rome with honor. Tonight you've received a golden invitation to dine with the emperor himself, an honor that should fill you with pride. But as you climb the marble steps of the Palatine Hill Palace, your stomach churns with dread. The guards at the entrance don't meet your eyes. They know what you're walking into, and their silence speaks volumes. The scent of expensive incense can't quite mask something else, fear thick and choking in the air. You enter the great hall where dozens of Rome's elite are already gathered. Senators, their wives, wealthy merchants, military commanders, all standing in uncomfortable silence. Then you hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor, accompanied by wild laughter that makes your blood freeze. Emperor Caligula enters, dressed in silk that shimmers like liquid gold, his eyes bright with a disturbing intensity. He surveys the room like a predator studying prey, then claps his hands together with theatrical delight. "My dear friends," he announces, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "tonight we shall discover who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall see just how far you'll go to prove your loyalty. What follows will shatter every boundary of Roman decency, turning the sacred halls of power into a stage for the emperor's darkest appetites. This is the story of how one man's madness corrupted an entire empire, and how absolute power became absolute corruption. To understand how the most powerful man in the world could transform his palace into a den of sexual depravity and psychological torture, you have to understand how Caligula became emperor in the first place. Born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, he earned his nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, as a child when he accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns dressed in miniature soldier's gear that charmed the legions. But childhood for a member of the imperial family was anything but innocent. By the time he was 7, Caligula had witnessed his father's mysterious death, possibly by poisoning ordered by Emperor Tiberius. He watched his mother, Agrippina the Elder, and his brothers disappear into exile, imprisonment, and eventually death, victims of the paranoid machinations of imperial politics. Imagine being a child and knowing that at any moment the knock on your door might be your last. Caligula learned to survive in a world where showing weakness meant death, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. He became a master of deception, presenting himself as harmless, while his family was systematically destroyed around him. This early trauma would later show up in his compulsive need to dominate and humiliate others, particularly those who reminded him of the power structures that had terrorized his youth. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed 24-year-old Caligula as emperor with genuine joy. Here was the son of their beloved Germanicus, the boy who had once charmed the armies. Rome had suffered under the paranoid, reclusive Tiberius for decades. They were ready for someone young, someone who promised a return to the glory days. For 7 months, Caligula seemed to be everything they had hoped for. He recalled political exiles, gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and held spectacular public games. The people loved him, but then something changed. Something that would transform the imperial palace from a seat of governance into a playground for the emperor's most twisted sexual fantasies. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell seriously ill with what ancient sources describe as a brain fever so severe that it brought the empire to a standstill for days. He hovered between life and death while Rome held its breath, praying for their young emperor's recovery. Some historians believe this illness caused permanent brain damage, while others argue it simply stripped away the thin layer of sanity that had been holding his darker impulses in check. When Caligula recovered, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. The young man who had once shown restraint and political wisdom was gone. In his place stood someone who seemed to have lost all connection to reality, all sense of boundaries between the sacred and profane, the acceptable and unthinkable. The transformation wasn't immediately obvious to the public. It began with small things: excessive spending, unusual behavior in private meetings, increasingly erratic decisions. But behind the closed doors of the imperial palace, a much darker change was taking place. Caligula had discovered something during his brush with death: the intoxicating realization that as emperor, he could do literally anything to anyone, and no one could stop him. The palace staff were the first to witness Caligula's transformation. Servants who had served the imperial family for years suddenly found themselves subjected to the emperor's bizarre whims and sexual demands. Young male slaves were particularly vulnerable. Caligula would summon them to his private chambers and force them to participate in acts that violated every concept of Roman dignity. But it was the female servants who suffered most. Ancient sources written in the careful language of their time describe how the emperor would prowl the palace corridors at night, selecting women at random to satisfy his appetites. These weren't consensual encounters. They were acts of pure dominance, designed to reinforce Caligula's absolute power over everyone in his domain. The emperor's sexual appetites weren't limited to servants. He began inviting the wives of senators and other high-ranking officials to private audiences, supposedly to discuss their husbands' careers or family matters. These women, raised in the strict moral codes of Roman aristocracy, found themselves trapped in situations where refusing the emperor's advances meant death, not just for themselves, but for their entire families. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical abuse. These proud Roman matrons, who had once commanded respect throughout the empire, were reduced to sexual playthings for the emperor's amusement. Caligula's transformation of the palace, particularly horrifying, wasn't just the sexual abuse itself, it was how methodically he used sex as a weapon to destroy the Roman social order. He understood that by forcing the empire's most respected citizens to participate in or witness acts of sexual degradation, he could break their spirits more completely than any torture. Perrault began hosting elaborate dinner parties that started as normal social gatherings, but inevitably devolved into orgies. He would invite senators along with their wives and daughters, initially maintaining the pretense of civilized entertainment. But as the evening progressed, the emperor would begin making increasingly inappropriate demands. "Senator Marcus," Caligula might say, "your wife has such beautiful eyes. I wonder what they would look like when she's on her knees before me." The senator would be forced to sit in silence, knowing that any protest would result in his family's execution. Meanwhile, his wife would be compelled to comply with whatever sexual act the emperor demanded, often while her husband and children watched in horror. The psychological damage to these families was often irreparable. Caligula took particular delight in forcing senators to watch as their wives were sexually degraded. He would arrange special seating so that husbands had clear views of their wives being forced to perform oral sex or engage in intercourse with the emperor or his designated partners. The men's faces, a mixture of rage, helplessness, and shame, seemed to provide Caligula with as much satisfaction as the sexual acts themselves. The imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill underwent physical modifications to accommodate Caligula's increasingly elaborate sexual fantasies. He commissioned special chambers designed specifically for group sexual activities, complete with elaborate staging and viewing areas. The emperor's bedroom became a particular source of terror, equipped with viewing areas and multiple entrances, treating intercourse as a public demonstration of his absolute power. Caligula also established what could only be described as a brothel within the palace walls, staffed by the wives and daughters of senators who had fallen out of favor. These women were forced to service not only the emperor, but also his guests, foreign dignitaries, and sometimes even common soldiers. As a form of ultimate humiliation, the emperor would often personally oversee these activities, providing commentary and direction like a theater director staging a play. Perhaps most shocking of all was how Caligula incorporated sexual degradation into the religious and political ceremonies that formed the backbone of Roman civilization. Traditional rituals were perverted into opportunities for sexual humiliation. During formal Senate meetings, the emperor would sometimes demand that senators' wives perform sexual services, making the act of governance inseparable from sexual degradation. Religious ceremonies were similarly corrupted. Caligula claimed divine status and demanded that religious rituals include sexual acts performed in his honor. Priestesses who had taken vows of chastity were forced to engage in public intercourse, while traditional religious festivals became excuses for elaborate orgies featuring unwilling participants. The emperor's marriage ceremonies became particularly notorious. He married and divorced multiple times, often within the span of days, using each wedding as an opportunity to sexually humiliate the bride's family, treating the sacred act as a public demonstration of conquest. Caligula's sexual appetites weren't just about personal gratification. They became a form of economic terrorism against Rome's wealthy families. He would demand sexual access to the most beautiful women in exchange for their families' continued safety, creating a grotesque marketplace. He even established a formal taxation system based on sexual services. Sexual slavery imposed on the empire's most privileged classes. Women who tried to resist faced horrific punishments, some forced into public sexual acts or sold into actual prostitution. The message was clear. No one, regardless of birth or status, was beyond the emperor's sexual reach. The impact on the women forced to participate was devastating and long-lasting. Raised in strict moral codes, they were reduced to sexual objects, suffering profound psychological trauma. Many attempted suicide, but their families faced collective punishment. Caligula delighted in breaking their spirits, using them as examples. Even more psychologically devastating was the forced complicity of Roman men. Senators and officials were often required to actively participate in facilitating these encounters, delivering their daughters or helping prepare their wives. This created psychological trauma that went beyond simple witnessing, turning them into accomplices in their own family's destruction. Resistance meant immediate execution. The inclusion of children in palace activities was one of the most disturbing aspects. Minors were forced to witness and at times participate in sexual acts, destroying their innocence and creating lifelong psychological trauma. Many grew up unable to form normal relationships or became perpetrators themselves, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Caligula's sexual terrorism extended throughout the empire through a network of officials who replicated his practices. Sexual abuse became a standard tool of governance, creating a climate of terror that affected millions. By 40 CE, Caligula's excesses were unimaginable. His announcement of making his sexual practices the official religion of the empire was the breaking point. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard. The new emperor, Claudius, faced the enormous task of dealing with the aftermath. The physical evidence of the emperor's crimes was extensive. Rooms equipped for sexual torture, collections of pornographic art depicting real palace victims, detailed records of sexual encounters that served as blackmail material against prominent families. Much of this evidence was quietly destroyed, not out of respect for Caligula's memory, but to protect the victims and their families from further humiliation. Rooms that had been sites of sexual abuse were sealed or completely renovated, as if the new administration was trying to erase the physical memory of what had occurred. This cover-up extended to the historical record as well. While ancient historians clearly documented Caligula's sexual crimes, they often used coded language that obscured the full extent of the abuse. Many victims and their families preferred this discretion, understanding that detailed accounts of their experiences would only perpetuate their humiliation. The most tragic aspect of Caligula's sexual terrorism was how effectively it silenced its victims. The Roman social system, with its emphasis on honor and family reputation, made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak openly about their experiences without destroying what remained of their social standing. Women who had been sexually abused by the emperor faced a society that would blame them for their victimization regardless of the circumstances. Men who had been forced to watch their wives' sexual degradation couldn't speak about their experiences without admitting their own powerlessness and complicity. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse often carried their trauma in silence for their entire lives. This conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of Caligula's sexual crimes may never be known, and many victims never received justice or even acknowledgement of their suffering. Today, the ruins of the Palatine evoke grandeur, but beneath them lie the echoes of horrors. The stones whisper the victims' stories. Caligula's transformation of the imperial palace into a theater of sexual horror, though brief, left a lasting lesson. Sexual abuse has always been a weapon of power. It's a pattern that repeats when absolute power corrupts. A reminder that the worst crimes destroy not just bodies, but souls. When we speak of abuse of power today, we still see the shadows of Caligula in countless institutions, from corporate boardrooms to political arenas, even in private homes. The mechanisms of dominance, the silencing of victims, the manipulation of societal structures to enable and conceal depravity. These are not relics of ancient barbarism. They are disturbingly consistent patterns that persist whenever individuals are granted absolute power and choose to wield it for malevolent purposes. The only difference between Caligula's reign of terror and modern forms of abuse lies in the scale and the documentation. Yet the fundamental dynamics remain chillingly familiar across centuries. Caligula's legacy is not just etched in marble monuments, but in the psychological scars passed down through generations of victims. His story is a stark reminder that the darkest chapters of history are not merely tales of the past, but powerful warnings for the present. If this story shook you, help us ensure that more people learn about what history often silences. Subscribe, share, and leave your reflections below.